if your life killed every dream you dreamed, it might be hard to believe your change is coming. And some of us as preachers are dead wrong for preaching to people that make $7 an hour, telling them their breakthrough is on the way. If you went to the beach and you saw a dead fish in the sand, you probably said, oh, poor fish, what happened to it? Did he drop out of fish school? Maybe his mama left him or his daddy left him. Oh, poor little fish, right? But if you went back the next day and you saw 1,000 fish on the beach, if you're smart, you're not gonna say, what's wrong with the fish? What you're gonna say is, what's wrong with the water, right? There's gotta be a problem with the water if these many fish have come up dead. So when people leave the church in droves, maybe the problem is not really with the folk that left. Maybe it's something in the culture and in the environment that drove them out. So I think before I would start to give any paradigm shifts or any commercials or any pleas to millennials and Gen Zs and such about the church, I think the church has to have an honest conversation with itself. Why do they no longer want to be here? And maybe it's because church folk mean. We weaponize the scriptures because we have issues with gender and sexuality in the church. So we weaponize it and we create a marginalized community even within the walls of our congregation, right? All of those things are the ugly side of structured religion because people bring to it their interpretations of God. And so they want to make God small enough to fit in the box of their understanding. And so if it doesn't fit in the box of their understanding, then it's antichrist, it's against God, you know. You're talking about world views colliding. We've got to deal with classism. I think we've got to deal with global and social issues more. And I think we've got to, again, re-examine what does loving one's neighbor as themselves, what does it mean in this context? The church has always been a cornerstone of particularly Black communities. It's always been the nurturing environment for many Black families, right? And I'm not using church exclusively to Christian at this point in the conversation. I'm using church just in terms of any religious institution or organization. Black folk have always found solace and peace in religious environments. Because those religious environments understood what Black folk needed at the time, we always did more than worship God in our churches. We had schools, a lot of HBCUs came up in the basement of churches, secret societies, Masons and fraternities, all these, you know, they met in churches, businesses. Church was a place where you had community meetings and information was shared in addition to the worship and praise of God. So the church has always been a number of different things throughout the generations. So, I mean, there's a lot of positive, but there are also some dark places that I think we need to reckon with in the church's history. For one, slavery happened under the watch of Christians, right? When Black folk arrived in Jamestown colonial government in 1619, and purchased, you know, that whole Dutch transaction, those were Christians who paid for those slaves, right? It's interesting that white missionaries went into the continent of Africa with the Bible, but they left with the gold, right? So we cannot deny that scriptures were weaponized right? You find a verse here, you find a verse there, you make it say what you want it to say so that you can do what it is you want to do in contemporary settings. Patriarchal systems that don't support women are white supremacy preached in black churches from people who have black faces. Europeans didn't just colonize territories or continents, they colonized information too. At what point in history did Jesus become white with blonde hair and blue eyes? How'd that happen, right? Or better yet, how did God become a man? when we know there are religions older than Christianity who thought of God to be female. So how do we get, and a black female? The black church in America started as an invisible institution. White folk didn't even know it existed. So planters and slave masters had their slavery churches, and they had their slave preacher that preached what they wanted them to preach and sing what they wanted them to sing. But that wasn't church. That was performance, right? Black folk had an entire invisible institution that their masters didn't even know about. And it didn't happen on Sunday morning at 11 o'clock. It happened at midnight. It happened at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning when they would dig holes in the ground and get in those holes and sing to God the way they knew and worship God the way they understood. Or they would put wet sheets in the trees and get in between wet sheets. You know, early church had a veneer of Christianity on top of it. It had all these indigenous African beliefs, right? And, you know, it had a little thin layer of Christianity on top of it. And, you know, and as generations of the enslaved found themselves in more environments that were laced with these evangelistic components of ministering and trying to get the enslaved saved, so to speak, for other reasons, then black folk started to make these connections between African indigenous beliefs and Christianity. They started to learn how to read. And when they learned how to read, they read stories of Moses freeing the slaves. They read stories of Jesus being rejected and beaten and crucified, but having raised from the dead. And they said, oh, I actually like this guy. So the church knew what that generation needed, is the point I'm making, right? You know, coming through Reconstruction and Civil War and Reconstruction, the church knew what black folk needed. You know, when the world opened up and white folks started letting black folk participate in the mainstream of culture, and black folk felt like white man's ice was colder. And all these mom and pop institutions in black communities that kept black communities afloat and survived died and crumbled overnight. And the black church was still, to some degree, knew what the black folk needed, but maybe, you know, are we starting to lose our way, right? I'm not convinced that the black church today knows what the next generation of black folk needs. And partly because we haven't asked. I was encouraged when I saw black folk out protesting this past summer. And I was also encouraged seeing those young people. And I remember being invited to a meeting. They wanted the pastors to come. And they wanted the pastors to talk to the folk. I said, talk to them about what? What you want me to talk to them about? Those folk don't even come to my church. But I'm so excited to see them out there because they got it. I may not be able to influence them. Now, their mama come to the church. Their grandma come. You follow what I'm saying? Right? You know, but somehow we've got to find a way to examine ourselves and say, what is it that we're preaching and teaching that's running them out the back door? What kind of environment do they find when they step inside our churches? And I'm not just talking about stained glass and carpet and pews. I'm talking about people. You know, are we rolling our eyes and looking at folk funny? You know, are we scared to have conversations on sexuality? You know, are we so archaic in our views about dating and marriage and divorce and remarriage that the church has become such a hostile environment that people are now looking for God outside of the scope and influence of organized religion in the church? I think some ownership from the pews has to happen too, right? You know, if people know they got bad theology coming from their pulpit, you need to say, Pastor, I appreciate the hoop. You know, the tune was good. You know, the organ was kicking behind you, but help me understand what you said. How'd you get to that place, right? You know, I think there's got to be some of that give and take, you know, especially if churches want to be around post-pandemic and if they want to have a generation to pass the baton to. And I think the church of yesterday has got to be comfortable if the church of tomorrow looks different. I started with this embedded theology, this Christianity by default. This is mama's God. And your mama's God was your mother's mother's God, right? But what I have found out is my journey with that God is very different. Like, I've come too far. I'm not interested in another God, right? I'm not interested. I mean, Jehovah is it. I'm not interested in another God. I'm Christian. You know, I'm satisfied with Jesus. So I'm not interested in being so enlightened that I lay him down.